The auctioneer had already dropped his voice into that clipped courthouse rhythm, the one that makes every bid sound final, even when nobody has lifted a hand yet. And Trent Hollis was standing in the back row with his cap folded in both fists, while his wife stared at the floorboards. Lot 3 was 320 acres of tiled ground with a good shelter belt and 2 machine sheds, and the opening bid stalled low because lenders were tight and cash buyers were waiting for Payne. Dale Ford stood near the side wall in a canvas coat with hydraulic oil on one cuff, looking like he had walked in to buy a used grain auger, not half a township. When the bidding hesitated at $4,600 per acre, one investor tapped out. Another shook his head, and the auctioneer called for $4,700. Dale raised 2 fingers without looking around. At $4,800 per acre, the room went quiet long enough to hear the register fan humming by the clerk desk. The gavel fell. 9 minutes later, Lot 4 came up. 210 acres from Kyle Benton's place, and the same rhythm repeated with less resistance. Dale took that ground, too, at $4,600 per acre. The clerk asked for a proof of funds before closing paperwork moved. Rena Patel, the regional agricultural banker, who had spent years asking Dale whether he was finally ready to modernize, walked forward with a folder and set 1 page on the table. Cash reserves entering 2023 had been $1,340,000, and 2 years of conservative grain sales had pushed immediate liquidity high enough to wire same day with no operating note attached. The same people who used to call Dale's machinery lineup a junkyard watched him buy 530 acres in one morning without asking permission from a lender. Nobody clapped. Nobody said anything ugly either. Trent and Kyle had children in school with Dale's nieces, and everybody in that room knew families who had stood in those same rows in the 1980s. The tension came from memory, not spectacle. Dale signed where the clerk pointed, folded the receipt into his shirt pocket, and drove home in a truck with 312,000 miles on it because he had hay to move before dark. That moment looked sudden from the outside. The arithmetic took 38 years. To understand why the men who mocked his equipment were signing leases on his land the next season, the story has to go back to a spring day in 1986 when Dale was 19 and still thought borrowed money was just part of becoming an adult farmer. His uncle, Calvin Ford, had expanded too quickly into high-interest equipment notes and a land contract that worked during good corn years. A dry summer cut yields, prices slid, and renewal terms tightened at exactly the wrong time. By the time the foreclosure notice came, Calvin had sold calves, liquidated machinery, and borrowed from relatives. None of it touched principal fast enough. Dale remembered the auctioneer's voice more than the numbers that day, steady and upbeat, while strangers priced out welders, gate panels, and his uncle's kitchen table as separate lots. He also remembered what did not happen. Nobody in town mocked Calvin. People shook his hand, loaded trailers, and said they were sorry. Compassion did not save the farm. Dale watched his father stand beside the feed bunks with his jaw clenched and say one sentence on the drive home. If you borrow against years you cannot control, one bad season owns you. Dale carried that sentence into every decision after. 5 years later, in 1991, Dale and Marlene Ford bought their first 160 acres. They were newly married, running a small cow-calf herd, and custom bailing at night to build down payment money. The purchase price was $168,000, built from $1,050 per acre. They put 20% down, $33,600, and signed a 15-year fixed land note at 7.25% on the remaining $134,400. Annual payment math on that note came to approximately $15,000. Marlene wrote those figures on the first page of a green ledger book and left 3 blank lines beneath them for risk notes. The first risk note she wrote was simple and harsh. If one income stream fails, payments still due. That line dictated behavior for the next decade. Dale kept one off-farm welding route, 3 mornings each week through winter. Marlene did feed invoices for a neighboring dairy in tax season. Every side dollar hit principal. They did not skip life. They kept it plain. Used pickup, patched roof, one family vacation to a county fair motel with a pool their son still talks about. Money had assignments before it had status value. From 1991 through 1998, the pattern looked repetitive to outsiders, and that was exactly why it worked. In 1991, they paid $15,000 on the note and $4,000 extra principal after a strong hay contract. In 1992, they repeated the $15,000 and added $6,000 after selling 42 feeder calves at $702 each. In 1993, a wet spring delayed planting, custom work dropped, and extra principal was only $2,000, so they cut household spending by $3,400. In 1994, corn yields recovered, and extra principal rose to $9,000. In 1995, the transmission failed on Dale's main tractor, an older unit already past the hour mark dealers like to mention. A replacement quote was $68,000 financed over 7 years. Wayne Kessler, local equipment dealer, ran the numbers across his desk and said the same line he told half the county. Old iron keeps you poor because downtime eats profits. Dale took the quote home, set it next to a rebuild estimate of $13,800, and chose rebuild with no debt. Marlene logged 57 shop hours, 3 salvage yard trips, and 1 midnight parts run in freezing rain. The tractor returned to the field and stayed there. The decision solved one obstacle and created another. Wayne started using Dale as a cautionary example in showroom talk, not with cruelty, more with certainty that frugality had a ceiling. Neighbors repeated it at the coffee counter. Dale did not argue. He had no appetite for public debate and no need to win one. What changed in that moment was procedural. Marlene started a full repair ledger with date, part cost, labor hours, and expected service life for every major component. Wayne had pushed hard enough that Dale wanted evidence future criticism could not wave away. By 1999, their land note balance was down far ahead of schedule, and fixed payment pressure had loosened. That shift made cash accumulation possible in a way people underestimate. A farm with mandatory annual debt service can survive average years. A farm with low fixed payments can survive bad years without panic selling. Dale and Marlene aimed for the second model. They retired the original 15-year note in 2003, 3 years early, using grain profits from 2 strong seasons and a disciplined refusal to roll gains into brand-new equipment. Once the first note was gone, acreage growth came in controlled steps. They bought 120 acres in 2003 from an estate sale at $1,650 per acre. Cash and a short seller-financed balance retired in 22 months. They added 140 acres in 2005 at $2,100 per acre, paid partly from retained earnings and partly from a 3-year internal family note repaid ahead of term. By 2006, they owned 520 acres outright, all notes retired, no liens on land, machinery, or grain bins. That year became a private marker in the Ford household. the year their operation shifted from surviving obligations to choosing options. The social reading in town moved in the opposite direction. Farmers who upgraded in the early 2000s looked modern and efficient, and many were managing debt responsibly. Trent Hollis built a larger row crop footprint with disciplined work ethic and real management skill. Kyle Benton expanded faster on variable rate operating debt because he was chasing scale before neighboring ground disappeared into investment funds. Their choices came from understandable pressures. Machinery got wider, labor got scarce, and missed planting windows were expensive. Nobody in this story is careless or foolish. They faced the same weather and input markets, and they chose different leverage. From 2012 through 2019, the contrast sharpened year by year. Trent replaced his planter and combine package on 5-year cycles, carrying fixed equipment payments near $214,000 annually by 2018. Kyle rolled multiple operating lines tied to variable rates, starting around 4.25% in 2012 and climbing in phases later. Dale kept rebuilding older tractors and combines with a different cost structure. His machinery average age in 2024 would be 29 years, and his main tractor would carry 18,400 hours. Figures that made some people laugh until they saw the ledger attached to those hours. The ledger told a plain story. Dale's annual repair budget sat at $48,000, including preseason inspections and major component reserves. A comparable late-model replacement fleet, financed and depreciating quickly, would have cost him roughly $186,000 per year in avoided depreciation and payment drag compared with his rebuild strategy. That gap, $138,000 each year before tax effects, became stored resilience. No motivational quote, no financial trick, just less capital drain. Marlene's book showed 2012 through 2019 cumulative savings from that spread at $1,104,000. Wayne Kessler still believed Dale was leaving productivity on the table. He had reasons. New machines offered guidance systems, lower per-acre fuel use, and fewer sudden failures under heavy workloads. The trade-off was financing burden and faster depreciation. Wayne lived inside a business model where upgrading kept farms competitive and his dealership alive. Dale lived inside a model where low fixed costs kept farms alive when competitiveness took a weather hit. Their disagreement stayed civil, and it stayed unresolved for years because ordinary seasons can validate both models at once. Public ridicule never came as one big confrontation. It arrived in smaller cuts that accumulated into social isolation. At a church fundraiser in 2016, someone joked that Dale's combine needed a museum placard. At a seed meeting in 2018, a consultant asked whether his low machinery spend was masking underinvestment. At a coffee table in 2019, Trent, trying to be helpful, said he could introduce Dale to a rep who offered 0% for 12 months if he wanted to join the current decade. Dale smiled, said he would think about it, and asked about rainfall totals. That restraint solved one internal battle. Dale stopped trying to be understood in rooms where visible spending served as shorthand for competence. Once approval left the equation, discipline got easier, not harder. He spent Saturdays rebuilding feeder house chains with no resentment. Marlene kept logging labor hours without apology. Their son asked once why they did not buy what others bought. Marlene answered from the sink, "Ownership means nobody tells us which month we are allowed to have a bad one." The kid nodded and went back outside. Philosophy stayed embedded in routine, not speeches. By 2021, pressure began moving from social to financial. input costs rose sharply. Fertilizer, diesel, seed, chemical, parts, everything climbed at once while rates moved upward. Farms carrying high-rate operating lines felt the squeeze first because each percentage point translated directly into monthly cash burn. Kyle Benton entered spring with a variable operating line at 5.1% that repriced higher through the year. By late 2022, portions were above 8%, and some renewals in 2023 touched 9.4%, depending on collateral strength and lender terms. Trent's operation absorbed costs longer through scale and strong management, though his fixed machinery stack reduced flexibility. Dale entered that same period with cash reserves that had been built quietly over many seasons. Entering 2023, reserves were $1,340,000. That did not mean he ignored risk. It meant he could buy inputs early for discounts, secure fuel when others delayed, and keep planning decisions tied to agronomy instead of panic liquidity. Reena Patel saw his balance sheets quarterly and started changing how she spoke about him in internal credit meetings. Skepticism gave way to numbers, first respect. She still asked hard questions. She stopped asking whether his model was accidental luck. The year that settled arguments came in 2023 with drought, broad enough to stress everyone, and hard enough to break leveraged margins. Rain shut off at the wrong growth stage, yields cut sharply across the county, and crop insurance checks helped, but did not close every gap once debt service and elevated input costs were layered in. Kyle had expected a recovery year to stabilize his line. The drought removed that recovery. Trent had strong agronomy and better hedging discipline than many peers. Yet large fixed equipment obligations left little room when gross revenue slipped and refinance terms tightened. The obstacle for both men was immediate and specific. Kyle could not cover operating interest, principal curtailment, and family living expenses simultaneously without liquidating productive assets at weak prices. Trent could service some obligations, though he could not carry all scheduled payments plus replacement cash needs into another uncertain season. Each met with lenders repeatedly. Each negotiated. Each sold what he could without breaking core capacity. A point arrived where retaining all owned land became impossible. Ground moved forced sale calendars because partial fixes had already been exhausted. Dale watched this unfold with no triumph in it. He knew both men. Trent had helped him pull a neighbor's calf in a snowstorm years earlier. Kyle coached junior high baseball with Dale's nephew. Sympathy did not erase arithmetic. Auctions were scheduled for spring 2024, and parcels would trade below ordinary market because bidder depth collapses when credit tightens countywide. Reena called Dale 2 weeks before the first auction and asked one question: how quickly could he close if he bid? Dale said same day on wire, 48 hours on recorded documents. She believed him because she had seen the reserve history. Auction morning carried no theater, only strain. Trent's 320 acres opened soft. Dale bought at $4,800 per acre, total $1,536,000. Kyle's 210 acres followed at $4,600 per acre, total $966,000. Combined acquisition reached $2,502,000. Dale used reserve cash and post-harvest grain sales to complete transfers without long-term equipment or land financing attached to the purchase package. Reena handled wire confirmations and county filing coordination, and by late afternoon title had shifted on both tracts. Dale drove home past fields he now owned and wished had changed hands under different conditions. The social reversal hit in private weeks later, which made it heavier. Trent came by the Ford kitchen first, removed his cap at the door, and asked whether Dale would consider leasing back the 320 acres so his family could keep farming. Kyle arrived 2 days later with the same request for the 210-acre tract. Neither man asked for favors dressed as entitlement. They asked for workable terms that kept equipment moving, kids in school, and a future still plausible. Dale and Marlene had full legal control in that moment, and they chose to use it with restraint. Flexible crop share terms became the practical bridge. Dale offered Trent and Kyle leases that lowered renter, downside in weak yield years by sharing risk instead of demanding fixed cash rent. For Trent on 320 acres, base share started with Dale taking 30% of crop revenue after agreed direct input allocations, with an adjustment clause dropping owner share to 24% if county yields fell below a set threshold. For Kyle on 210 acres, base owner share was 28% with the same downside adjustment and stricter cost controls on optional inputs. Settlement timing followed harvest cash flow, and no fixed deficiency clause forced either family into another forced sale after one bad season, so the terms explicitly preserved their ability to keep farming. The lease request resolved years of social distance in a way no argument could have. Dale never gave a speech about debt or discipline. He reviewed maps, asked about family budgets, and signed pages where Marlene flagged lines. Trent's shoulders dropped when the last signature landed. Kyle stared at the floor for a few seconds and said, "I can work with this." Dale nodded once. The room changed because power changed, and the power did not get weaponized. Humane rebalancing looked plain on paper and huge in lived reality. Wayne Kessler's reversal came through parts counters and service records rather than public apology. In late 2024, he visited Dale's shop to inspect a transmission housing source and found binders stacked by year, each repair logged with costs and hours since last major service. He ran his own rough model against late-model trade cycles and saw the same spread Marlene had been tracking: $48,000 annual repair budget versus $186,000 annual depreciation avoided compared with a new finance fleet. At the counter that winter, he told Dale he had called the approach false economy for years, and the ledger proved that call wrong. The dealer also made an operational change that mattered locally. He expanded his parts stocking for older drivetrains because more farmers asked for extension life plans after seeing what happened in 2023 and 2024. Wayne admitted in a winter producer meeting that showroom cycles do not define every viable strategy. He said Dale's approach outlasted several assumptions, including his own, and left the sentence hanging without drama. Nobody laughed. People took notes. Practical humility moved faster through a county than people expect when bills are due and memory is fresh. Reena Patel's role shifted too. Early in her relationship with Dale, she had framed his model as conservative outlier behavior, stable but limited. Auction season and post-sale performance forced a different framework. She began using his records when coaching junior lenders on stress testing, emphasizing liquidity windows, fixed cost load, and downside survivability across multi-year shocks. In 2025, she also started financing young farmers Dale recommended, not as favors, as underwritten opportunities with disciplined support structures around them. One of those names was Noah Ellis. Noah was 27, technically skilled, and trapped in the common rural gap between competence and entry capital. He could run a planter, tune a combine, and manage variable rate application maps while he had no family land base and no path to purchase enough machinery outright at current prices. Succession risk on many farms lives right there. Older operators exit. Younger talent exists. Ownership transfer fails. Dale and Marlene had been discussing that risk for 2 years because their own children chose different careers, and the unresolved concern was simple. Who keeps this ground in a low-debt operating model when they step back? Auction gains gave them capacity to act instead of just worry. In early 2025, they offered Noah a starter lease on 140 acres, with supervised machinery access and clear performance triggers. He would farm the parcel under a crop share structure, use selected Ford equipment maintained to strict standards, and contribute labor hours to off-season rebuild work, so he understood true machinery cost, not just field operation. Marlene built the agreement with monthly review points and transparent cost allocation. Noah accepted, then showed up at 5:40 in the morning before first tillage pass with his own grease gun and a list of questions. Dale liked him immediately for that detail alone, and the succession concern moved from theory into a working plan. The generosity piece expanded beyond leases because Marlene wanted something durable after watching multiple neighbors' children shelve AG plans for financial reasons. In late 2025, the Fords established a local scholarship fund with an initial $250,000 allocation, managed jointly, focused on 2-year diesel technology and agronomy programs tied to return to county service commitments. First-year disbursement was $20,000 across 4 students. None of it changed the Fords' lifestyle much. It changed options for families who had been one tuition bill away from opting out of agriculture entirely. By the end of 2025, the numbers that once looked disconnected formed one coherent ledger. Total owned acreage reached 1,050 acres, built from 520 acres owned debt-free by 2006, plus the 320-acre and 210-acre auction purchases in 2024. Lease structure in 2025 placed 320 acres with Trent, 210 acres with Kyle, and 140 acres with Noah, leaving 380 acres in direct Ford operation and forage rotation. Machinery remained old by showroom standards, average age 29 years in 2024, anchored by the main tractor at 18,400 hours. Annual repair budget held near $48,000. Net worth at end of 2025 stood at $6,420,000, with no long-term debt attached. Marlene's breakdown to Rena listed land at conservative market valuation near $5,880,000. Machinery and shop assets around $220,000. Cash and marketable reserves near $320,000 after auctions, lease setup, and scholarship funding. Grain inventory and prepaid inputs rounded the remainder, with no hidden liabilities outside ordinary payables cleared within cycle. The figure did not appear from one lucky trade. It represented a philosophy tested by weather, rates, social pressure, and time. Trent's resolution was concrete by harvest 2025, renting his previous 320 acres under flexible crop share, remove fixed land debt pressure, and let him right-size machinery obligations. He sold one underused high-capacity tractor, refinanced remaining equipment at manageable terms, and finished the season with positive operating margin for the first time in 3 years. Pride took a hit, family continuity survived, and his oldest daughter stayed in the county school where she wanted to graduate. Trent still worked long days. He stopped spending nights staring at amortization tables he could not control, And the lease terms did exactly what they were written to do. They kept his family farming. Kyle's resolution took more intervention and more discipline. His 210-acre lease came with strict budget checkpoints Marlene insisted on, including fertilizer purchase windows and fuel hedge limits. First quarter meetings were uncomfortable. Kyle had built habits during expansion years that treated shortfalls as temporary. The new model forced weekly cash awareness. By October 2025, he had reduced operating volatility, rebuilt vendor trust, and kept his crew employed through harvest. He told Dale one evening that renting had felt like failure until his youngest son asked if they were still farmers. He realized the label survived ownership changes, and those lease terms preserved that identity in practice, not just in words. Wayne's resolution looked modest from outside and meaningful inside the dealership. Parts sales for older equipment lines rose 22% in 2025 after he expanded inventory and technician training for rebuild programs. New machinery still moved, though buyer conversations shifted toward total cost curves instead of monthly payment optics alone. Wayne now offered 2 proposals side by side: replacement plan and rebuild life extension plan, with assumptions documented. He remained a dealer, not a convert to one philosophy. He became more honest about trade-offs, which in agriculture can be the difference between pressure and collapse. Rena's resolution sat in lending outcomes. The young farmer portfolio she structured with stronger liquidity covenants and mentorship links to operators like Dale posted better early performance than prior cohorts built on aggressive expansion assumptions. Default risk did not vanish. Exposure became more survivable. Her relationship with Dale settled into practical collaboration, periodic reviews, no hero narratives, no sentimental language. She knew exactly what his strategy could and could not do, and she trusted his recommendations because he attached numbers, not promises, to each one. Noah's first season on 140 acres ended with competent yields under difficult late summer heat and clean books that impressed Marlene on first audit pass. He completed every maintenance hour requirement, learned why the old Ford Combine needed specific pre-harvest calibration, and finished the year with enough retained earnings to fund next season's input share without outside borrowing. Dale allowed him access to one additional implement in winter after he rebuilt a worn hydraulic valve bank under supervision. The arrangement stayed disciplined and human at the same time, and it resolved the Ford succession concern with a named operator already proving he could carry the system forward. Dale and Marlene's own resolution was quieter than every reversal around them. They still lived in the same house, still drove older vehicles, still tracked every line item because habit had become identity. Social treatment in town changed once acreage records and lease maps became public. People who had dismissed Dale's equipment strategy now asked for his maintenance templates and reserve targets. He shared forms freely and skipped commentary. Validation arrived without relief in it because he had stopped seeking it years earlier. What mattered to him was simpler. Operations under his roof could absorb bad years without sacrificing people. One final arithmetic thread tied the whole arc together. If Dale had followed the replacement cycle, common in his county, from 2012 through 2019, the modeled annual depreciation and finance drag at $186,000 would have consumed $1,488,000 across 8 years. His actual annual repair budget at $48,000 totaled $384,000 across the same period. Difference, $1,104,000. Add conservative compounding, disciplined grain marketing, and restrained household draw, and the reserve entering 2023 at $1,340,000 becomes understandable instead of mysterious. The reserves then made 2024 auctions possible without predatory financing. A different choice at any earlier hinge point would have changed that ending. If the 1991 note had run full term with no extra principal, fixed payment pressure would have lasted longer and delayed reserve building. If Dale had replaced his tractor in 1995 instead of rebuilding for $13,800, downstream machinery policy likely shifts toward higher annual obligations. If social ridicule had pushed him into status purchases in 2016 or 2018, cash buffers thin before rates and drought arrive. Each decision resolved a specific obstacle and opened one narrow corridor where the next decision stayed possible. The county still tells the story as if the reversal happened in a single courthouse morning when a man in an old coat bought land in cash while better-looking operations unraveled. That framing misses the underlying dynamic. Stealth in Dale's life was never a trick and never a tactic. He did not hide wealth to surprise anyone. He simply refused to perform wealth in visible ways that weakened ownership underneath. Neighbors read appearance and drew reasonable conclusions from their own framework. Reality used a different framework, one measured in obligations carried through bad years. By winter 2025, the fields looked ordinary again from the county road. Trent and Kyle were farming leased ground with less pressure and renewed dignity. Noah was building a base he did not inherit. Wayne was stocking parts he once dismissed. Raina was lending with stress cycles in mind. Dale was in the shop replacing a worn bearing before it became a mid-season failure. And Marlene was upstairs reconciling lease distributions with scholarship disbursement schedules. No loose drama remained, only working systems that had proved they could carry people through hard seasons. The final record was clean and complete. Dale Ford and Marlene Ford co-managed 1,050 debt-free acres and a scholarship fund seeded at $250,000. Trent Hollis rented 320 acres from Dale under flexible crop share terms that preserved his family's operating continuity. Kyle Benton rented 210 acres under similar flexible structure and stabilized his business while staying in production. Reena Patel continued financing young farmers with stricter risk frameworks and relied on documented field economics. Wayne Kessler sold parts and rebuild programs alongside new machinery and publicly acknowledged that Dale's repair strategy outlasted showroom assumptions and his own earlier dismissal. Noah Ellis farmed 140 starter acres with supervised machinery access, entered his second season with positive retained earnings, and gave the Ford operation a concrete succession path. That is what the neighbors eventually understood. The junkyard look was cosmetic. The ownership underneath was durable. Arithmetic corrected the record slowly, then all at once.